Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 92 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on the living room of an apartment in the south side of Chicago, a largely black working-class neighborhood. The furnishings in the room are typical and undistinguished. Their primary feature is that they have had to accommodate the living of too many people for too many years, and they are tired, as are the family who struggle to make ends meet here, led by the matriarch, Lena Younger, who lives in this cramped apartment with her 3 grown-up children, as well as her son's wife and her grandson. But the fortunes of the Younger family are about to change because Lena is expecting to receive a substantial payout from the life insurance on her recently deceased husband. All the members of the Younger family are hoping the money will help them to realize their individual dreams, to escape the poverty and prejudice that oppress them. Their route to emancipation does not unfold as they expect, however, and they are forced to make life-changing choices. This is the groundbreaking domestic drama of Black civil rights and personal dreams, A Raisin in the Sun, written in 1957 by a young Black writer named Lorraine Hansberry. I say groundbreaking because when A Raisin in the Sun opened at the Ethel Barrymore Theatre on Broadway in March 1959, Hansberry became the first African-American female author to have a play performed on Broadway, and she did so with her debut at the age of 29. The play was also groundbreaking because of its realist portrait of a Black working-class family. As the writer James Baldwin wrote, "Never before in the entire history of the American theater had so much of the truth of Black people's lives been seen on stage." In the 2 years following its New York premiere, A Raisin in the Sun was translated into 35 languages and performed all over the world. Hansberry's own screenplay of A Raisin in the Sun was filmed in 1961 with Sidney Poitier and Ruby Dee. We record this episode very shortly after an acclaimed new production of the play has finished a UK tour that concluded at the Lyric Hammersmith Theatre here in London. I very much enjoyed the production and the chance it offered to delve into this landmark play, so I'm delighted to be joined today by the play's director, Tinuke Craig. Welcome, Tinuke. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Tinuke has worked with the National Theatre, the Royal Shakespeare Company, and the Old Vic in London, where from 2021 to 2023 she was Baylist director. Her directing credits include the RSC's The School for Scandal, The Colour Purple at the Curve in Leicester, Sarah Kane's Crave at Chichester Festival Theatre, and a wonderful production of August Wilson's play Jitney at Leeds and the Old Vic, which inspired our own episode on that play with Tony Marshall and Will Johnson from the cast of her production. Tinuke has also just been named Associate Artistic Director at Regent's Park Open Air Theatre. Congratulations, Tinuke. The Open Air Theatre is a magical venue.
Thank you so much. I've just started. It's really exciting.
Yeah, it will be. So my first question is, what was it about A Raisin in the Sun that inspired you to want to direct it?
Well, it was a combination of things. This doesn't happen very often to directors, but it was one that I was asked to direct. So Headlong wanted to do it, and partly because of the good time we'd had on Jitney, which was also a co-pro with Headlong. They thought that it would be a nice chance for us to reunite again and that Raisin in the Sun might be something I'd be interested in, and they were right. I mean, it's an incredible play. It's so watertight in its writing. It's so well made. And I mean that in the trope sense, but also in the kind of like really craft sense. Like it's a really, really well crafted piece. And there are a few things that attracted me to it beyond that. One is I think the characters are so vivid. And I think one of the things I enjoy most as a director is working with actors to make characters that feel really believable and truthful. And I'm really interested in relationships and interpersonal relationships between people. And that's where I enjoy my work the most, is when I'm able to pick apart those relationships. And family dramas tend to be really fertile ground for that. But A Raisin in the Sun is a particularly strong one. And like Jitney, actually, it does something that I always enjoy, which is a lot of people cramped in one space. Just because I think, your true colours really bubble to the surface when you are confronted with nowhere else to go. So family dramas, I think, are really fertile ground for that kind of intensity. It's much harder to kind of conceal how you really feel when the pressure is on like that. Also, a bit like with Jitney, I think workplace dramas and family dramas are particularly good for this, because what you get in those two setups are people who wouldn't necessarily choose to spend all their time together were they not forced to by circumstance. And that, I think, brings out something really interesting in people.
So we don't necessarily choose our family, but we have to live with them.
But we have to live with them, and we don't necessarily choose our co-workers, but we have to work with them. And I think that tension between who you are and who you have to be with other people is endlessly fascinating to me. And that's sort of personal. That's before you even get to the political. It's such an extraordinary piece in terms of its groundbreaking history, in terms of its connection to true stories. And also it's bringing up huge ideas that still feel like really big ideas now. In the same way that they must have done in 1957, it feels like a really evergreen piece. And there was something really exciting about going into something that just plays, that you don't have to mess with and that you probably shouldn't mess with, really. That felt like a really exciting thing to do.
Yes, well, as you said, it's well made. And of course, you talked about the interpersonal relationships and how that fascinates you. That's where drama really is, I would contend.
Yes.
I talked a little bit about who Lorraine Hansberry was and the breakthrough with this play, but tell us a bit more about her life. She packed a lot into a short life, didn't she?
Yeah, she died tragically young. She died at 34. But she, in her life, was this really dazzling, trailblazing person, kind of in everything she did. Even as a young child, people talk about how forthright and confident and willing to go against the grain she was. She grew up in a relatively affluent home, certainly affluent by comparison to a lot of African Americans at the time. She was passionate about education and literature and music. She played music, she painted, she was a bit of a Renaissance woman. She was a lesbian and very confident and proud and sure in that capacity, which I think is really interesting for the time, and interesting now even, that she wrote so openly and joyfully about her homosexuality. She was politically at the forefront. She'd grown up in a pretty political household and was, people would call her radical, certainly. There were certainly tabs on her wondering if she might be a communist. She moved in these really dazzling, really literary circles. She was godmother to Nina Simone's children. Nina Simone's song Young, Gifted and Black is about Lorraine Hansberry. She's just an absolute star, and wrote Raisin the Sun when she was about 29. And then by the time she passed at 34, she had left this endless legacy. A really extraordinary woman.
Yeah, she wrote 4 more plays, I think, but A Raisin in the Sun, the best known. I believe the play is based in part on real-life events in her life, in particular what happened to her family when her father bought a house in the Washington Park neighborhood of Chicago when Lorraine was 8 years old. Can you tell us a bit about those events?
Oh, I can, but I feel like I always muddle them up.
Well, go on, give us a try, because it's an extraordinary story, isn't it?
Well, her father bought a house in a predominantly white or entirely white area, and there was a petition from the community in that area that they not move in. And sort of like what happens in the play with Lindner. And then her father refuted this, and it ended up becoming quite a big court case in which her father fought that you shouldn't be able to discriminate on who can buy a house based on the skin colour, as I understand it. And that was quite a big inspiration for young Lorraine, who was only about 8 or 9 when that happened.
That's right. The family moved into this all-white subdivision and were met with great hostility. And then, as you said, the so-called Improvement Association of the neighborhood filed an injunction for them to vacate their home. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where Lorraine's father actually won the judgment, although that didn't overturn the restrictive covenants that applied. And this is something I was horrified to discover in research about these restrictive covenants that had been widespread in the United States, which enforced racial segregation in housing areas. They were intended to keep white neighborhoods white. I read that 90% of the housing projects built in the years following World War II were racially restricted by these sort of covenants in many, many of the major American cities. So this became a landmark case, and as we'll discover, features in this play as well. I mean, the hostility, bricks were thrown through the Hanburys' windows, and her mother used to patrol the house at night armed with a German handgun. It's just terrifying. I wondered if we could give listeners who are not familiar with the play a brief introduction to the main characters and the plot of the play.
Yeah, absolutely. So the play is all set in the living room in the Younger family household. In the house, you have Lena Younger, who's the matriarch. You have her oldest son, her only son, Walter Lee, who is about 35 years old, and his wife, Ruth, a little bit younger than him, 30. Then you have Lena's daughter, Walter's sister, Beneatha, who is in her very, very early 20s, a college student. You have an unseen character, Mrs. Johnson, who actually in some editions of the play does come on stage and have a little moment, but doesn't in others, didn't in ours. You also have Walter and Ruth's son, Travis, who is only 10 years old. Then you have two suitors for Beneatha. So she has two young men who are sort of potentially interested in dating her. One is Joseph Asagai, who is a Nigerian student studying at her college. And the other is George Murchison, who is a wealthy young black man from the rich black family in the area, the Murchisons. You also have Bobo, who you meet very briefly, who is a friend and associate of Walter's. And you have Carl Lindner, who is a member of the Clybourne Park Improvement Association. And then the plot effectively is that Big Walter, so Lena's husband, has passed away a year before. And when we meet the youngest, they are about to get his life insurance check through, which is $10,000, which translates to about $100,000 for us.
A lot of money.
A lot of money, life-changing money. And there is a bit of contention about what should be done with that money. Walter would like to use it to invest in a liquor store with Bobo and with a guy called Willie Harris, who we don't meet. There is a desire for that money to go towards Beneatha's schooling, especially because Beneatha wants to be a doctor and that would really help her through medical school. Lena has some designs on potentially having a new home, which Ruth is quite interested in as end because they live in this tiny flat that isn't really serviceable and becomes less and less so as they get older, as Travis gets bigger, everything else. Travis sleeps in the living room. And so there's a real tension about like who has claim to this money and who should be the person who says what's done with it and how should it be divided and who does it even really belong to. Asagai says later to Beneatha in the play, was it your money? Would you have even had it if your father hadn't died? And what does it say about a world where money depends on the death of a man? You know, there's a sort of sense of you didn't earn it. And so do you get a say in it? So the money comes in. Lena uses a good chunk of it to buy a house. That chunk of it is about what Walter was hoping to give to his investment in the liquor store. It's not all of it. It's about $3,500. Walter is really upset about this, not least because it's also transpired that Ruth is pregnant. His wife is pregnant with their second child. So there's a bit of tension and time around that. Because Walter is so upset, he starts going on a bit of a drinking binge. He's really unpleasant, really horrible to everybody. And Lena, in an attempt to save that, suggests that even though she's put $3,500 down in the house, there's $6,500 left, and that he might take a bit of that and put it in an account for Beneatha's medical schooling, and everything else can go to him, and he can decide what he does with that money and be basically in the kind of treasurer of the family.
And invest in a business plan he's got, as you said.
Invest in a business plan he's got. Although she's more sort of suggesting that he should take that money and be really sensible with it, but that he should be in charge of it. And that partly why he's been so angry and so volatile, she thinks, is because he's felt so emasculated by not being able to run his own household. And if he has this money, he'll be able to run his own household. Of course, what he does is instantly take that money and put it all into the liquor store, including the money for Beneatha, which turns out not a good idea. Bobo turns up, tells him that the money has disappeared, that Willie Harris, who was the sort of ringleader of the scam, he didn't know it was a scam at the time, but it turns out it was. Willie Harris then takes that money and skips town, and we don't know where he is, and we don't know what has become of him, and that's all the money gone in one fell swoop. Meanwhile, Carl Lindner, who is the president of the Clybourne Park Improvement Association, the only white character in the play, turns up at their house during a happier moment and says that the people of Clybourne Park would like to basically buy out the youngers, so give them the money back that they paid for the house and more, paying them not to move into their area. At first they refuse that, but once Walter loses the money, it becomes a bigger question about whether that maybe is something that they should do. And then it becomes a question of dignity and pride. They do need the money, but do they need it bad enough to debase themselves in that way? And that's the question that takes us to the final scene in the play, where Walter, in the last possible moment, decides to rescind on the deal, and they decide they will move into their house with or without that money. They'll start from scratch and they'll do it with their heads held high. And that's our final image of them, which on the one hand is a triumph, but on the other hand, kind of isn't, because what we know is that they're walking into the belly of the beast. We know that they're going to be treated horribly. We know that their house is going to be firebombed. It's not necessarily a win, but it's a necessary move for them to keep their pride.
Great summary. And we will come to the end when we get to the end, of course. There's lots to say about the end. Yeah, it's a fantastic story, full of human drama between the family. We see all these individual characters beautifully drawn, but also a plot with the money and the buying the house and Walter losing the money. It's full of drama. I wanted to talk to you about the form of the play. I've seen it described as social realism, and Hansberry herself said that she hoped that her work was genuine realism. So we get a pretty realistic picture of the life of this working class family living in what was called the Black Belt, or ghetto even, of the south side of Chicago, which was one of the things I think, that, as I said, that made it different in 1959 on Broadway, isn't it?
Yes, it was. It was very rare to see such a, and like James Baldwin said as well, to see such a vivid and naturalistic or realistic iteration of what it was like to live in one of those houses and what the insides of those houses looked like, which a lot of the Broadway audience wouldn't have known. So it would have felt like a big deal.
Yeah, and there are lots of details that tell you about the challenges of this family. The apartment, as you said, is not big enough for all of them. I mean, Travis, the grandson, sleeps on the couch. The kitchen's in the living room. It is, in fact, the same place Lena and her husband moved into when they got married. So they've been there all these years, and the family is still living there with them.
Yeah, there's a stage direction where Lorraine Hansberry writes, "Weariness has won in this room."
Ooh, yeah.
Which feels like a lovely way of considering.
Yeah, and it's dark. There's only one little window. The bathroom's out in a communal hallway, and they have to compete with the neighbors in the building to get into it. So yeah, it sounds bleak, and their challenges are real, but the play's also funny and warm.
I would say so, yeah. I think it's really funny. It's really funny. And if you get a funny group of actors, you can really, really push that. It feels really real, and real people are funny. People make jokes even when they're in dire straits. People make light of things that they shouldn't make light of. I think what feels truthful and funny about the show is actually that in lots of ways it's just really human. None of the jokes are laboured, none of them are there for comedy moments. But it's funny because people are funny.
And it all comes sparked out of, I think, just relationships within a family, which is what families do, right? There's bickering, some of it lighthearted, some of it less so. But I wanted to ask you also about the title of the play, which is distinctive. Tell us where this title comes from and what it signifies.
Yeah, it comes from a poem by Langston Hughes called A Dream Deferred. Sometimes it's called Harlem, which opens with the question, what happens to a dream deferred? And then you get these images of what might happen to a desire unmet.
Can I stop you for a second? Because it's a very short poem, which is the epigraph for the text. And I think, did you, in your production, was it read out?
Yeah, it was.
Do you have it handy? I think we should just read it for listeners.
Yeah, I'm sure I do. Let's see. Here it is. So, this is Harlem by Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?
Wonderful. So, how would you say the play reflects the ideas in the poem?
Yeah, in some ways, the poem feels like a sort of thesis statement for the play, doesn't it? We sort of treated it like one in the room. And I knew the poem already. Weirdly, it was a poem that I had on my wall in my room in university.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Isn't that mad? I went and saw a musical called Simply Heavenly that was set in Harlem. And in the programme, there was a copy of that poem, and I cut it out and put it on my wall.
It's fate.
Fate, completely. But yeah, I think for me, the play is all about that. It's about what the hell do you do with your wants and desires if you live under a system that can't realise them? And what happens to untapped potential? What happens to unmet desire? What happens to dreams deferred? And you see that in all the characters. They all have these very particular driving wants. And when they can't get what they want, they manifest in different ways. You know, Ruth's withers and dies a little bit within her, right? Whereas Walter's, it feels like that final line, or does it explode, feels really applicable. So he talks about it himself at one point. He says, I'm a volcano, right? There's this sort of sense that there's something bubbling underneath him all the time that he can't quite reach, he can't get out of. And Beneatha is a really interesting character in terms of how she factors into this, because her dreams haven't been deferred yet. They get deferred during the show. There's something quite interesting about how free and easy and breezy she can be, because her dreams are still very much within reach until they aren't. So yeah, I think it's laced all the way through the ways that we cope with our unfinished business.
Yeah, you're right. Each of the characters has their dreams, but they seem to be getting further away or drying up, or worse. As you say, with Walter, they may explode, and these deferred dreams can destroy us and those around us. And I also thought there might be a sort of larger sense about, the American dream not fulfilled, but very specifically, of course, the dream of freedom and equality for Black Americans.
Yes.
Is that being indefinitely deferred, and will it explode into violence?
Absolutely. It's a big question, right? Like the American dream is not so much a dream as a promise, and then that promise is often broken. It's an offering, it's a truth that you grow up in. And I think there's something particular about the American psyche and how an unrealized dream might sit within that structure, because I think it's either Mark Twain or John Steinbeck. I'm going to butcher this quote. It's something like, the American people will never be able to rise and overthrow their oppressors because rather than seeing themselves as the oppressed proletariat, they see themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. I've butchered that quote. But I think there's something of the idea that you're about to be granted the life you were always promised. You're about to be rich. You're this state that I'm currently in, where I'm being beaten and oppressed and squashed and hampered and exploited by a wider system designed to keep me down, is merely temporary and just of my own making, and I can just fix it if I just get one little chance. And I think that as a promise that you give to a nation is, I think it's capitalism that's seeped all over the world. It's not like the British are exempt from that, but I don't think it's as woven through the national psyche as it is in the States.
No, and Walter epitomizes that, doesn't he? And the odds are stacked against him, but he still believes somehow and resents the fact that others have it and he doesn't, and the system is stacked against him.
Yeah. And something's fair, but not in a way that, I think you see this all the time. You certainly see this here. There's a system that is destroying communities, ripping away resources, denying children their futures. And that is true. And then people get really angry about that and they go, it's probably the immigrants.
Yes, Walter has always someone else to blame.
Yes, someone else to blame, and never the system, weirdly. He never looks at the whole system until really near the end, when he starts to see the whole world for what it is. He sort of blames the people around him. He goes sideways, right? He blames his family, his mother, his sister.
All black women, in fact.
All black women, all of them, which is just fascinating as well, right? He's the only adult man in that family.
But somehow he's being dragged down by the women.
And therefore, the women are all somehow the architects of his downfall, as opposed to the people who are holding him up.
Yes, complete nonsense.
Yeah, the audience can see that these women are holding him up, but he can't see it at all, which is also how privilege works, right? You don't see, you think you did it yourself, and very rarely you did,
We'll talk about Walter in even more detail in a minute. You talked at the start about the fact that the play has a range of vivid, rounded, real characters. And one of the most interesting features of the play, I think, is that there's really no single protagonist. Everyone in the family is given an equal story. And as we've said, they all have their dreams.
Yeah.
The other thing I think to say about these characters is that they're not just individuals in a family drama, but they each represent a different perspective on the definition of Black American identity at the time in some way, which makes the play richer, and it's informed by Hansberry's social and political concerns, of course. Can we talk a bit about each of these characters then, and what their dreams are, and what they represent in the identity of Black America, say? Let's start with Lena, or Mama, as she's called in the text, and by the family, because she's a traditional family matriarch, isn't she? What are her dreams, and what does she represent?
So I think it's complicated, because I think you're right, they do all represent different things, but I think they often represent more than one thing at once. I think there's quite a lot of overlap between them, so it's not so much that each of them is a sort of totem for a different facet, but rather they all contain a few of these facets, and some of them contradict each other. But I think for Lena, you're looking at someone who has worked their whole life and who, by rights, should now be able to reap the rewards of the work that she has put in. She's paid into this economy. She has worked herself to the bone. She has paid her dues, and it should be that she's about to get a fallout. But of course, that's not how society works. It's certainly not how American society worked towards Black women at that time. So you see there an unfulfilled promise, or someone who has not gotten what they deserve, and yet keeps striving, keeps working, no nonsense, no fuss. There's something quite interesting, I think, about when she has the idea that she could get a house. Her first thought is, well, we'll all have to go back to work. I'll have to start getting a bit of day work again. Do you know what I mean? Like, she's immediately puts herself back in the workforce. So I think for me, her dreams are about, in lots of ways, her dreams are about her children. They're not so much about her.
Yeah, I think she's always like any mother. She puts her family first. She's always thinking about her family's security and prosperity.
And their success kind of is her success, right? And she talks about her children as her harvest. She says, you who are supposed to be my harvest, I'm supposed to be able to invest in you, and then you pay back to me. That is a kind of cultural system that we have globally across the world, right? That there's a sort of generational handing of a baton, that she has worked really hard and handed it on really diligently, and expects her dreams to be realized because of that, and her children have other ideas.
And her dream is particularly about the house, of owning this house with a garden, as she had dreamed of doing when she was first married, but was never able to do so.
And in a really practical way, she has like the house would mean that they've moved up. It would mean that they have some sort of privacy and space. And the garden, I think, is a really practical thing, which is that she wants to be able to grow some flowers and grow some vegetables. And she has her little plant on the windowsill that becomes this huge totem for so much of what the play is about.
I was going to ask you very specifically, that's my next note, was about this little house plant, which serves as a symbol for her and the whole family's dreams, in fact, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's this little plant. It's doing its best. It can't quite grow to its full potential because there's not enough light. And yet somehow it doesn't ever wither. It doesn't ever die. It keeps going. Yeah, it's almost too on the nose in some way.
Yeah, but I loved it because it's stuck in this little dark apartment with one window, so there's not enough light for it to grow. As with the family who are stunted by being trapped in this apartment and neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And also associated with it is the sunlight, which the plant needs to grow. The garden and the house offers sunlight. In fact, Ruth asks Mama if there's a whole lot of sunlight at the new house. And the sunlight's freedom as well.
Yes.
So, yeah, a bit on the nose, but I still love it.
You know, there's a musical of Raisin in the Sun, which I don't know very well at all. But A Whole Lot of Sunlight is the name of one of the big songs in the show.
Okay, yeah. The plant also echoes something about Lena's connection to the land, and her thinking about the garden brings into mind the land of her ancestors in the South, because the historical context is that the family is one whose ancestors were slaves and sharecroppers and who migrated to the north to the urban centers in huge numbers after the Civil War and on. And she talks about that past, doesn't she? So there's a context where we talked about what she represents in terms of African-American identity. There is that history that she's closer to, of course, than her children, which I think is important because there's a lot about what is the legacy of the past for African-Americans.
Yeah, completely. And a sort of sense of how much do you revere and honor your past while also trying to carve out a new future for yourself. One of the confrontations between Mama and Walter, the mother and son, is about that, about the fact that he wants these things that she feels are not honorable. She says, how come you talk so much about money? He says, because money is life. She says, well, we used to think freedom was life. There's a real schism between what they consider to be honorable, what they want, what they think they deserve, and what's enough. Nothing is enough for him, whereas she has enough, and the fact that they're in the North at all. The place she sees as a salvation, he sees as a prison.
Yes, it's a complete contrast in values because of that history. She talks about coming from 5 generations of people who were slaves and sharecroppers. In my time, we was worried about not being lynched and getting to the north if we could, and how to stay alive and still have a pinch of dignity, too. Now here come you and Beneatha talking about things we ain't never thought about hardly at all. So there's different concerns for the next generation. And as you say, particularly Walter, which let's talk about Walter. As we touched on, Walter's dream is the American dream. Money is life, as you just said. But his is a dream that can fester and go bad, and seems to go bad because he's consumed by it, may even explode, as we said.
Yeah.
And he's pig-headed and bullish. And most of the time we think this dream is a pipe dream, don't we?
I think we do, yeah. I think part of his issue, the problem that Walter has, or the problem of Walter, is that he is brilliant, I think. And I think that's an important thing to say when we give our litany of things about him, which is that he is stubborn and rude and deeply misogynistic and kind of a prick and ungrateful, and all these things are true. I also think he's extremely dynamic. He's really clever, or he would be. He's not educated, but he's clever. And they're different things. This is an uneducated, intelligent man. So this is a profound level of brain power that has nowhere to go and hasn't been honed in any particular way and hasn't been shaped or molded or guided. The tragedy of him is untapped potential. And Mama talks about this with Ruth, you know, in the moments where Mama and Ruth are together, they talk about Beneatha and Walter as being extraordinary. They are extraordinary young people. There's something about them. They're particularly dynamic. They're particularly front-footed and confident and brilliant and sparkling and charismatic.
I was going to say he's got charisma and he's charming in some way. He's just boiling with energy.
Yeah, but there's nowhere to put it. And that's the dream deferred, right? There's nowhere to put it. And that can turn you into a bit of a monster, right? Untapped potential it's a tragedy.
So it's an assault on his self-worth as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because America measures the status by the money, and he feels he's down at the bottom and wants to be at the top. In fact, he's got this classic fantasy of the big shot executive in an office with a secretary and driving Cadillacs and all that, which is why we think it's a fantasy.
Yeah.
So I was going to say that, the way it goes for him, he gets the money and he's got this scheme to invest in a liquor store, but he gives it to the wrong guy and it just disappears.
Yeah.
The reality is we see this coming a mile off, don't we?
Yeah, we see it. But also partly, we're watching a play, right? We know something's going to go down.
Well, yeah, but I say we see it, and yet the moment it happens, it's still shocking and devastating. It's like that inevitable surprise.
It absolutely is. And also you get this horrible wave because the money goes. You know it's not going to go well, but you don't really know how.
That's right.
What about this is going to go bad? And then when you find out actually it's one of his compatriots, it's the guy he's been talking about the whole time that betrays him, that feels cruel and unexpected. And then also because Bobo is this sweet, lovely guy who comes in to deliver the news. And so you're sort of watching it in this really human way.
And he's also lost his money.
And he's also lost all his money, right? So you see the human face of this for everybody involved. And also, I think even then, when you know that he's given the money away, you don't quite know until Lena says it if he's given away Beneatha's money.
That's true. Though you expect that might also go really badly.
Yeah. So you're like, okay. She goes, is the money gone? Yes. All of it? Yes. Beneatha's money too? Pause. All of it. And you're like, oh God, like not Beneatha's.
But when Mama hands all of the money to him and says, put this away.
Oh yeah, it's. And even if you miss it there, the next scene is him talking to his son going, I'm going to make a transaction tonight. You're like, don't. But I do think you maybe think, okay, well, maybe he'll take out Beneatha's. I live in hope. But of course he does. Of course he does.
I think one of the things that strikes you is about why it may go wrong as well is that he is so desperate that his judgment may not be very good either.
No, I think that's what I mean by it's hard to see it when you're in it. It's hard to make good, healthy choices in your eating when you're really, really hungry. It's just like, something needs to happen. And he says it, when he talks to George Murchison, he talks about George Murchison's father, and he says, your father is like me, invest big, gamble big, hell, lose big if I have to. And he says that. He's already that guy. He's sort of putting on a bit of swagger and bullshit for George, but he's also, that's what happens.
Yeah, he's going to roll the dice, isn't he?
Yeah, and he does. He invests big, he gambles big, and he loses big.
What I was going to say, though, is that as a result, he learns something, doesn't he, the hard way. He seems, in the course of the play, and with this, let's call it humiliation even, he seems to grow up in some way from that moment. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think there's something about realizing that his family is sort of all he has. The one constant in his life is these women who he's denigrated and dismissed. There's something of realizing that like when everything else is gone, you're going to be looked after, you're going to be cared for, and you're going to be loved by this family. And therefore you should stand up for them. I think there's something there for him. And he has, he has a realization about the systems at large, right? He has that big speech where he's like, I realize that this world is divided into the takers and the tooken, Some of us are always getting tooken. Once he understands that that is a systematic thing and not a personal thing, he's able to move through the world differently.
And also I think it's by contrast between him and Mama's attitude to the family that he realizes some responsibility to give back to the women who supported him and to the generations that he's part of. So he has this wonderful speech, which is set up by him talking to his son about, he's going to be rich and he'll look after his son. Of course, he fails to do that at that point. But he realizes that he has some responsibility in the generational line of his family. As he says, when he turns down Linder's offer, it's on behalf of the sixth generation, his son.
Yeah.
And what he has inherited from his father, which he must try to preserve and pass on. So he's thinking more like his mother, not just about himself, I guess, at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can we talk about Ruth, one of the long-suffering women? What was, or is her dream, whatever it may have been, it seems to have been lost along the way somewhere, hasn't it?
I think for Ruth, she just wants to feel like she can take care of the people around her and that they can take care of her. Her dreams are simple, but that doesn't mean they're not important, and that doesn't mean they're not valid or respectable. But I think what she really wants is to be a wife and mother, and loved and acknowledged as a wife and mother who's really, really good at being a wife and a mother.
Well, speaking about a wife, what about the relationship with Walter? Because things aren't good there, are they?
Yeah, no, they're not good there. I mean, they're not good there, but I think they're hot and cold, those two. He's horrible to her. If I was Ruth's friend, I would tell her to get out. I think most of the women sit in the audience watching that couple and going like, these guys need to break up. Especially in that opening scene, because you're like, oh, they're really at each other. But actually, I think it becomes really apparent over the course of the show, I hope, that they would be okay if the world would give them the grace and the circumstances under which to be okay. Divorce is higher in working class and Black communities. That's not because Black people don't know how to stay married. It's because it's really, really hard to keep a relationship going when you're working 3 jobs and you don't get to see each other much,
Yeah, there's no doubt their relationship is strained by their circumstances. She's beaten down.
Yeah.
I mean, he says to her, you're tired, aren't you? You're tired. And she is. She's exhausted by the struggle.
Yeah.
But you do see, I think you're right. There's a scene where after he's been incredibly cruel to her when he comes home drunk, he then seems to regret it. He realizes he's stepped over the mark. And there's this sort of residual tenderness between them, I think, where they start to talk about this problem because
Yes,
they haven't been communicating. And I think you get a glimpse that they had a past when they were really in love and they're young and happy.
yeah.
And when he has the money and thinks his scheme is going to come off, they go to the movies and some of that's being rediscovered.
Yeah.
You do know that's there, but you're right, it's being oppressed.
It's being pushed and strained and stretched and squashed. I mean, this is not me making excuses for the way he treats her, because I think he treats her appallingly, but I think it's really important to remember that it's really hard to stay loving and caring and be a really good covenant and team under those circumstances. It's really easy to stay married and have a really nice time if you go on regular holidays and have a babysitter.
I think people can still screw that one up too, but anyway.
Of course they can, and they do on a regular basis, but they've got a slightly more fighting chance.
The breaking point for her is being pregnant again.
Yes.
And this is really hard to watch, isn't it? Her despair that she feels so little hope, she cannot imagine how to keep this baby.
Horrifying, especially for someone like Ruth. That's not necessarily a characteristic decision. It's not that she doesn't want to have another baby. It's that she can't have another baby right now because of the circumstances they're under, right? It would be a very different thing if she were just like, oh, I just don't particularly enjoy the processes of bringing up children and it's not right for me or my family in this moment, which would be a completely reasonable reason to consider that choice. But that's not what's happening here. She would have this baby if she could. She just doesn't feel like she can.
No, she's in enormous pain about that.
Yeah, it's horrifying for her. It's a hellscape for her, right? And Mama puts it really well: when life gets ugly enough, a woman will do anything to protect her family, the part that's already living. She feels she has to have that termination in order to protect Travis and everybody else. It's not about whether she wants to have a baby or not. She would.
It somehow becomes more pointed even because Lena had lost a baby.
Yes.
When she was young, and says to her at one point, there's ain't nothing can tear at you like losing a baby. I think she says it when she doesn't know.
Oh, no, she does know. Or she suspects.
Okay.
It's feeling terrible and she suspects, but doesn't want to really look it directly in the eye.
Yeah, but not helping Ruth, I don't think, in dealing with the anguish of that.
And the thing about pregnancy is that you're on a clock, right? So there's a pressure all the way through. It's not that she has to do something about this.
Oh, and she's also sick. I mean, literally physically sick.
Yeah. She feels terrible. Like, early pregnancy is awful. Having to do all the things she has to do with that in mind. Yeah, it's grim.
So tough for Ruth, and perhaps this is why she's the most desperate to escape, which she is, and says she'll do anything to get out of the ghetto. It's interesting how much that house represents the possibility of change and leads her to think she can actually have the baby.
Yeah.
Because there will be space, for one thing, as you said.
There'll be space and there'll be some hope, I think. They live in a state where they don't have much hope, and the house represents hope and potential.
Yes. What about Benitha, then? She is different, as you suggested, because she's younger, significantly younger. She represents, I think, a new generation of American woman.
Yes.
Not fully formed, it must be said.
Yeah.
She's headstrong and naive. But as you say, like Walter, she's very bright and determined, and she challenges orthodoxy in so many ways. She's really a feminist, isn't she?
Yeah, absolutely. She's absolutely, at the very least, a sort of proto-feminist, right? Like, she's having all the ideas. But also, she's 15 years younger than Walter. And I imagine there's a little bit of tension there. We talked about this a lot in rehearsal, that circumstances must have changed sometime between having Walter and having Benitha, that she was able to go to medical school, right? That was suddenly on the cards as a possibility, which I think often happens with siblings with big age gaps like that, because your parents' circumstances change. And Benitha is having a life that probably would have served Walter quite well if Walter had been able to be put through college. So I think there's a sort of an interesting thing there between them.
It's also, I wondered, it just occurred to me because I have several sisters, but my youngest sister, we always used to think she ended up as the favorite.
Yes.
And maybe he feels a bit of that. Anyway, that's a bit trivial.
No, it's not. We talked a lot about sibling dynamics, what that feels like, what it is to be the only boy, what it is to be the only girl, what it is to be the oldest. It means if that age gap is massive versus if it's very small. Those things are really important, especially in a family drama and especially when they all live in such close quarters. But I think also with her, she's really smart and she's beautiful and she's full of potential and she's interesting and funny and she's quick. And also, she knows that about herself. So, and I don't mean that in like an arrogant way. I mean, she can be arrogant, but I don't say that to make that point, but rather she's fully aware of what an absolute fireball she is. She's fully aware of the impact that she has and she knows what she deserves.
But she can be annoying with it.
Oh, deeply annoying. She's 20.
As young people do, yes.
Yeah, she's 20 years old. And I think, there's only 10 years between Beneatha and Ruth, but in that 10 years, the attitudes have shifted massively. They feel like a different generation, those two.
But in terms of her proto-feminist outlook, I mean, she challenges all the men.
All the men.
On equal terms. She isn't for getting married as the only option.
No. Young men often think that they are competing with other men for the affections of young women, when in fact they are competing with being single. George thinks he's competing against Asagai. He's not. He's competing against what would happen if she didn't have to be with anybody. She'd probably have quite a good time. She really wants them to bring something into her life. And if they're not doing that, she doesn't really see the point. Which for Asagai is an easy thing to get his head around. George really struggles with that. He's like, what do you mean?
Yes. I think Hansberry doesn't have a lot of time for George, but we may talk about him or we may not bother. But with Beneatha, she's also exploring her identity in other ways, isn't she? Because her interest in Africa is piqued by this relationship with Asagai, who's from Nigeria. And so she starts looking towards Africa for part of what her heritage and identity is, which is one of the themes of the play, I think. I was quite surprised, actually, by how much there is in the play about Africa.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Mainly in the figure of Asagai, who comes from Nigeria, and about their new independence and the potential for African countries independent of colonial power, but also what it means in relation to African Americans and how much they look to Africa as part of their identity or not, or are they primarily thinking about assimilation, which is, I guess, what the figure of George represents.
Yeah, it's like, how do we beat this thing, right? We're in a system that is designed to oppress us. Do we push against it, kick against it, rebel, or rather just exit it? Do we opt out of a white supremacist structure as much as we can, build our own thing? Or do we find a way to assimilate and work within it? Which is the sort of endless question, right? I don't think that question's been even remotely answered. Like, I have my preferences. I think kicking out is a far more interesting and dynamic choice, but that comes at a cost.
Well, I don't know. It's interesting in the play, isn't it? I don't think it resolves it clearly because it's not very easily resolved, obviously. And as I said, I don't think Hansberry has a lot of time for George.
No.
I mean, he's called a fool and he's condescending and he's definitely chauvinist.
Absolutely. But he'll be okay.
He's successful, right? Exactly.
She doesn't like him, and neither, generally speaking, the audience don't like him either, but he's rich. He's going to be okay in a way that we cannot guarantee for the youngest, even after they get the house. And so I think there is a question about George has sold his soul in many ways. And the question is whether or not that was the right deal. Might have been.
Yeah. The African identity, Beneatha actually literally puts on some Nigerian robes and does something with her hair and dances to African folk music. I mean, it's slightly naive, I suppose. But there is, I think, for Hansberry, a live issue for that.
Yeah, she's trying to work something out, right? I think Beneatha is trying to find her identity. They say that in the text. She goes up to Asagai and says, I'd love to talk about Africa. I'm looking for my identity. I think there is something also about, and this is one of the interesting things about doing the play in the UK, because this isn't a particular conundrum that Black people or people from the African diaspora face in the UK in the way that people in the States do, which is that the wound for Black people and for people in the African diaspora in the UK is a wound that starts with colonialism, right? It's having your nations overrun and overtaken and your systems dismantled and your customs mocked and your all of that. But invariably, if you're a young or youngish person living in the UK, you've got a granny with an accent, you sort of know where you're quote unquote from. I know my granny is Jamaican, for example. Ken, who plays Asagai in our production, he's Nigerian. His parents both born in Nigeria. You sort of know what your link is to the motherland. That's a much harder thing to do as an African American because slavery has decimated your family history. All you know is that you are a descendant of the transatlantic slave trade, and here you are, and you don't know if your ancestors are from Benin, you don't know if they're from Sierra Leone, you don't know if they're from and that, on the one hand, what that does beautifully and really excitingly is that it forces you to create African American culture. You have to have your own culture within the place that you've been stolen and taken to, which is not the conundrum that Brits face.
That's very challenging too, because without the roots, what are you defining yourself as?
Well, exactly.
And I heard this reference this week even to James Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time, in which I believe he argues that Black people in America should not be labeled African Americans, but simply American.
Yes, and he's right.
Because they have been there as long as white Americans. I mean, if you think by extension, white people are not called European Americans.
No, in fact, yeah. And actually, white people don't ever have to have a hyphen, right? They just get to be just themselves. Everyone else has to be Asian American or, Hispanic American or, whatever.
Yeah. And so I don't know whether he's deliberately distancing or separating themselves from being defined by African origins in that way, because it's impossible to find them in any case, as you suggest.
It's impossible to find them. But then, is there something of just getting as close as you can? Somebody who is Nigerian and might be able to connect you to that culture, and at least then you could go there and be on the landmass and be on the soil, and maybe you could get some, if you feel lost in any way, any connection you can get, you'll take, which I think is completely understandable. That search for Africanness, even if you are unable to position yourself specifically as to where you fit into the African continent, that desire makes a lot of sense to me. It's why, this is a slight tangent, but it's why I think Black Americans were more taken than Black Brits about Black Panther, because the notion of Wakanda is not particularly interesting if you know that your family are from Ghana, but is really interesting if you need to create a fictional African space that you might belong to. So I think there is something there for her. I also think for Beneatha, she tries stuff out. We dig into the African identity bit because it's quite a big part of her working out who the hell she is. But actually, we also see her try out being a musician. We also hear about the time she tried to be a photographer. We also hear about the time she decided she was an equestrian.
Yeah. So her mother says she's flitting from one thing to another all the time. And that was going to be my question then. Assegai makes her a real proposition to move to Africa and potentially be a doctor there. And of course, Beneatha has the idea to be a doctor was inspired when she was young because she wants to care for other people. It's not like Walter who just wants to get rich for himself.
Yes.
So there is something in there about how she might be tempted to do that. But here's my question. Where do you think she goes? Is she going to Africa or not?
Oh my gosh. It's so hard to say, right? Because I read Beneatha's play, Kwame Kweyama's play, that's sensibly a sort of sequel in which she does go to Nigeria and with Assegai. So I sort of have it in my head, but that's lore that has been planted, that's sort of canon. If I didn't have any connection to that, what do I think she would do? I don't know if she would go to Africa with Assegai, but I'm sure she would find her way there eventually.
Yes, that's a good point. At some point in her life, she will go.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a real possibility. I don't think it's just a fad like the guitar.
Yeah, and even if she flits, he doesn't, right? He knows what he's talking about. So
yes, and again, I was struck by how much there is in the form of Assegai about the future of an independent African country and the way that might go. And I read that Hansberry basically associates the independence of African nations with the challenge of gaining civil rights in the United States. They're somehow correlated. Now, I wanted to talk about the scene with Carl Lindner, the only white man in the play. So we've talked about the hopes and dreams of these characters, but it gets really dramatic, I think, with his arrival from the Clybourne Park Improvement Association. The perversion of that name in this context is just fantastically chilling.
Coded, yeah.
The presumption being that the association believes that their neighborhood will be improved if Black people are not allowed to live in it.
Yes.
Hansberry's writing of this scene is just fantastic. It's full of tension and drama, but it's so quiet. And in the way that he presents this case, pretending to be so reasonable, people were gasping in the theater.
Yeah. It's the sort of banality of the cruelty, right? I mean, it's really interesting because, when we worked on that scene with Jonah, who played Carl Lindner brilliantly, we talked so much about the fact that part of the reason it's so chilling is because not only is it all the language couched in this idea that, he's just being really friendly and he's doing this sort of in their interest as well as his. And
race prejudice simply doesn't enter into it. He actually says.
He says that. And actually, I think part of the thing that we worked on so much and part of the thing that Jonah and I talked about is it's not just that he says that. He sort of has to really mean that. Like, I think on some level, he has to think he's a really, really good guy. He's not like those other racist white people. He's not like, he's reading about the Klan and lynchings and Jim Crow stuff, and he's not like them. He's civilized and reasonable and lovely, and, he's perfectly happy to see Black people thriving, just not near him, thank you very much, just because people thrive better in their own communities. That's all. There are a million ways to play Carl. But for me, we talked about the fact that, if you scratch the surface, obviously there's depths and wells of racism underneath, but he has to think he's not racist.
Well, ostensibly, he makes the point that he thinks Black families are going to be happier living in their own communities, particularly if they're going to meet with, and it becomes a not very well veiled threat, meet with people who don't want them there. And he says that people can get awful worked up. Whether he's talking about himself, he realizes that others might.
No, I think for the actor has to think he's not talking about himself. Because remember, he's been nominated. He's the one that they think he's the nice guy. There's probably other people in the Clybourne Park Improvement Association who have much stronger opinions about what ought to happen to these people. They send Carl because Carl's the one who might be able to be diplomatic about this.
But that diplomatic language is what makes it so much worse.
Yeah, it's vile. This is not my defense of Carl.
The twisting of the language is sophistry of the highest order and just repellent for its pretense at righteousness and reasonableness. It's stunningly done.
Yeah, it's a beautiful bit of writing.
I can't resist a quick diversion here, if I may, because the character of Carl Lindner and his attempt to buy the family off reminds me of the connections between this play and Bruce Norris's Clybourne Park, written in 2010, which is in some way a modern sequel to A Raisin in the Sun. It actually starts barely an hour after this play ends, I believe, with Carl Lindner going back to Clybourne Park. Now, we don't have time to go into all the connections between the two plays here, but suffice to say that it is a fascinating and very clever updating of the themes in this play, which demonstrates, I think, as you said earlier, that the issues in this play are very much still alive. If you'd like to know more, we did do an episode of the podcast on Clybourne Park, so it would be a great companion to this one after you're finished here. Let's move towards the ending. So, at the end of the play, the family make this momentous decision to go ahead with the move, despite the implied threats. So what do you think we're to make of this decision? It's a statement of hope, of following their dream, but we also fear for them, don't we?
Yeah, I think we have to fear for them. We've been told by Carl already that they're not welcome there. He says, why do you want to go somewhere you simply aren't wanted? We know that they are, at the very, very least, going to meet with a hostile environment, but probably far, far worse than that.
Yeah, because there are references earlier in the play to bombs going off.
Yeah. People are throwing Molotov cocktails through windows. People are firebombing Black businesses.
So the threat of violence is real.
Yeah, it's really, really real and likely. And so actually what they're doing by making that move is though they are confronting that violence. They are saying, we as a family are going to stand up in the face of this and say, we're not going to take it. We deserve to be here. Their move will become an act of protest, kind of, whether they like it or not. Walter says we're not going to fight any causes, but actually them being there is fighting a cause. And so I think on the one hand, that final scene, that final image, you can enjoy it and it can feel lovely and hopeful. And there is hope, but it's not as simple as a happy ending.
No, I was going to ask you because I read apparently in an earlier version of the play, Hansberry ended the play with the family having moved into the new house and are sitting in the dark, armed and awaiting attack by their new neighbors. So why do you think she didn't use that one? Or what do you think about this ending compared to that?
I mean, I'm quite intrigued by that alternative ending, I have to say.
Really? Why?
Well, I think just because I think...
it's more on the nose, isn't it?
Definitely more on the nose. And I suppose maybe, if we were doing that version, I don't know if I would necessarily have them all armed. But I think there is something helpful about that version's explicitness. Because, when this play first went on, a lot of critics missed the menace. They missed the fact that they were walking into the belly of the beast.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of the early reviews of the show were about the heartwarming story of triumph. Yeah, people talked about it in this really schmaltzy way.
That's pretty blinkered.
But then, there are these amazing essays from Lorraine Hansberry, these responses to critics in the New York Times, responses to people in these tribunes that were saying these things, setting them straight about what that ending really means. But, I suppose there is a danger with that subtlety that people miss it.
I don't think it's that subtle.
I don't think it is either, but you look at these reviews at the time and you go, my God. And also at the time, it would have surely felt less subtle because the bombings, etc., would have been happening as they spoke.
Yes.
I think generally speaking, and I hope in our production we've managed to hold on to that, one should know that that ending is quite ambiguous in terms of how much joy and despair is in that mix.
Absolutely. Though, I mean, as you said, Linder issues the warning, I think, and you've had some evidence, as we've said already, of other things going on in the world outside. I think I like the subtlety or the ambiguity of this ending, and it does at least offer some more hope in the balance, I suppose.
But also there's a third version, which sometimes gets done and sometimes doesn't, which is this additional scene with Mrs. Johnson, where the neighbour, Mrs. Johnson, comes downstairs. They sort of refer to her a few times. They're all using the bathroom and they're borrowing cleaning supplies from each other. And she comes downstairs and she talks about really explicitly that black families are moving to white areas and having their houses blown up.
Yeah, I read that scene, and I actually think it's better without because it is too explicit. It's better to just show, not tell, and she just tells it all. You talked about the critics, and I think she may have received some criticism for the presentation of this black family, that maybe she was offering white audiences a cliche of black identity. This raised a question about the challenge of her writing about black lives and characters for white audiences, which of course would largely be on Broadway at the time. She may simultaneously be seeking to demonstrate how black people's position in the world is different from white people, while also reminding white people that black people are fundamentally just people like all other people with universal human characteristics, and they're not one homogenous thing. We have a range of characters, of course. So I wonder, do you see these two things going on in her intent with this play?
Yeah, I think in some ways what I like about the play is she's not that bothered about her white audiences. She's sort of making a piece that feels truthful and real, and she's got a story to tell and characters that are so vivid and so truthful. And whilst I'm sure she was fully aware that that play would be mostly seen by white people, in the same way that, frankly, that's not that different now on Broadway. It's certainly not different in the UK, even with a play like Raisin in the Sun.
So you think she wasn't necessarily writing for them? She was writing truthfully?
I think you've got to start with what's the story you want to tell before you go to who am I telling it to. And I think the piece is so robust that whilst I have no doubt she had an awareness of white people's interpretation of her work, I don't think she was writing it as a treatise to convince or change the minds or enlighten white people.
It was just truth.
And it's just truth, right? And that's why the play works, because as much as it has so much capital P politics in it, it actually doesn't have an agenda. It just goes, this is the truth. This is what actually would happen. This is how these people actually talk to each other in these actual living quarters.
This actually therefore works on both counts. It must be, because I'm a white person watching it, and one of the effects is that I recognize myself in the desires and disappointments of these characters. So it reinforces human commonalities rather than difference by race. But I also recognize that would be too reductionist and sentimental to say the Youngers are simply the same as white working class family, because their family dynamics, their challenges, their dreams, the circumstances of their lives, they're facing specific racist challenges. And their own identity is found, as we've talked about, on this historical legacy of race, which is repeatedly referenced in the play. So it is different as well. So it does both.
Completely. But it does both of those things by really, really clarifying, really truthfully what their circumstances are and who they are. It's just deeply, deeply honest, right? It's real people in real circumstances.
So let me ask you finally, I think, the play can be placed, as we've talked about, in a specific context of Black American history. At the time it was written, of the early years of the Civil Rights Movement, of African decolonization we mentioned. But do you think the play we watch today feels like a period piece? Is its portrait of a Black family in that time now dated?
Not especially. I think there are very particular things to their circumstances that are dated.
Why is it still relevant then?
Because of the truth, because those people exist anyway. We watch it and we go, Walter Lee reminds me of my dad, he reminds me of my brother, Ruth reminds me of my mother. It's really hard to not connect on a personal level with those characters. And in the same way that, like, The Cherry Orchard is a period piece, but I don't watch it to learn about the early 1900s. I watch it for the people. I think it more sits in that category. Death of a Salesman is a period piece, but that's not why you go and see it. It will prevail.
Yes, and we face many of the same personal challenges. We have our hopes and dreams and the obstacles in front of us. But there's also, I think, more general things still apply. Prejudice still applies, lack of opportunity based on prejudice.
Yeah.
The pressures of poverty and housing in particular, women's opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. And, your sort of reproductive choices and how you bring children into the world. I mean, it's all still there. All of that still matters. 'Twas ever thus, right? Those T-shirts that say same shit, different day. It's that.
That answers the question, I would say. Right. Tinuke, that's just fantastic. Thank you so much. What a great conversation.
Great. That was lovely.
Before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guest to recommend another play that we might cover on the podcast, or one, it's just a personal favorite, actually. Is there a play you love that you could suggest to the listeners?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you've already covered it, but I shamefully had not read until very recently August Osage County.
No, we have not done it.
Oh, it's so good. just talk about family dramas. August Osage County by Tracy Letts. It is a family who gather together after the death of a father. So, thematically, there are some links between that and raising the son. This is a very different set of people who handle their untapped potential and dreams that haven't come true very differently. But it is such a brilliantly windy, twisty, funny, well-observed piece of theatre with all the things you really, really want from a really, really good play. It's edge of your seat. Either something comes out of the blue and you had no idea, didn't see it coming, but of course, as soon as you hear it, it makes perfect sense and falls into place, the amazing, surprising inevitability at the same time, which is the dream. Or it also has that thing of you're reading it, and you know what's going to happen, but they don't know. And you're reading it like this, going, no, don't do it, It's the first thing I've read for ages where I can imagine watching it the way you watch sport, where you're sat on the edge of your seat going, what are you doing? What are you doing? So I can't recommend it highly enough.
So Tinuke, I think you have to do it sometime. Fate.
Oh, I'd kill to do it, honestly.
Right. Well, when you do, come back. We'll talk about it.
Let's chat about it then anyway.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you also for your production. I really enjoyed it. And to have the chance to come and visit this play with you is a real treat.
Thank you.
As the curtain falls on the younger family's moving day, what do we feel about their decision to go forward to move into Clybourne Park? We have no doubt that they will face ugliness and hate, but we also know from what we've seen of these characters that they will fight, just as Lorraine Hansberry's family fought for their rights. And being the first to stake their claim there means that another family may follow, and another, in pursuit of their dreams of an equal society. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.